So let's take a look at this first very odd, I would say, argument from Socrates about uh, this notion that all things come from their opposites, and that this has certain implications for death. Um, it's interesting to see in the opening remarks that the Greeks, ancient Greeks, shared a kind of reincarnation idea with the ancient Indian culture. It's reflected in the Bhagavad Gita, this idea that the souls of the dead come back, and that the living come from the dead. That is a general belief that is sort of floating around in the Greek world. But I think that what we can see is that in this company, amongst these men, that is generally regarded as a religious idea. That is, there is no firm religious faith in reincarnation amongst these men, and Socrates' point about things coming from their opposites is a purely logical point. That is, it's important to see that he is not relying upon some faith in reincarnation here, or some deeply held commitment to the idea of reincarnation as in the Bhagavad Gita, that it is a purely logical point, and that is, if we can find it on the first page, he says in the bottom, this is Socrates speaking, then let us consider this question, not in relation to man only, but in relation to animals generally, and to plants, and to everything of which there is generation, everything that comes to be, that comes into existence. And the proof will be easier. Are not all things which have opposites generated out of their opposites? And that's the basic thesis, that all things which have opposites are generated out of their opposites. I mean such things as good and evil, just and unjust, and there are innumerable other opposites which are generated out of opposites. And I want to show that this holds universally of all opposites. I mean to say, for example, that anything which becomes greater must become greater after being less. Now that makes a certain amount of sense, right? That last example, the notion that if something becomes greater, it must have at one point been less. That seems to be logically required. That is, if we say that X, the tree, let's say, has grown larger, that at one point it must have been smaller. It's logically implied. If it's larger, what's larger than something? And whatever it's larger than is smaller than. And so I think it does make sense. That is, that the larger comes to be from the less large, or from the smaller. And Socrates makes a lot of that in the sense that anything which is generated comes to be through a process. He says that on page 2. He says, and in this universal opposition of all things, are there not also two intermediate processes which are ever going on? That is, this process of becoming, going from one thing to another, and back again. Where there is a greater and a less, there is also an intermediate process of increase and diminution, growing smaller. And that which grows is said to wax, get larger, and that which decays to wane, to get smaller, like the waxing and waning of the moon. And there are many other processes, such as division and composition, cooling and heating, which equally involve a passage into and out of one another. And this holds of all opposites. And he talks about waking and sleeping. That is, those are two, we generally think of them as two opposite states. But that waking, if one has awakened, that logically implies that one has been asleep. And if we consider then sleep being the opposite of being awake, then awakening is generated out of its opposite, being asleep, and vice versa. If one is asleep, now I guess we can logically think of a creature that sleeps forever, but normally we think of being asleep or falling asleep, excuse me. That would sort of logically imply being awake, and we could say that, again, if sleep and wakefulness are opposites, then sleep comes from its opposite, wakefulness. And so this kind of makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, at least with regard to things that are generated. And certainly when we talk about comparatives like larger and smaller, yes, if something has become larger, it has become larger from a previous state of being smaller. And if something is smaller, then it has become smaller from a previous state of being larger. And we can play around with that, talk about lighter and darker, of something getting louder from the less loud, or from the quiet, and things like that. I mean, it does kind of make sense, and the question is, how widely does this apply, and does it really apply to death? After talking about the processes of falling asleep and awakening, on page 3, Socrates applies it to death. And at the top of the page, Socrates says, "Then suppose that you analyze life and death to me in the same manner. Is not death opposed to life? Yes. And they are generated from the other. And they are generated one from the other? Yes. What is generated from life? Death. And what from death?" And then Sebes, his friend, says, "I can only say in answer life." That is, there's a resistance on his part to make the claim, because he doubts it, but he's, on the basis of the premises that Socrates has put forth, it's kind of an inevitable answer, and the question is whether those premises are sound. That is, Socrates believes then that if life and death are opposites, and if all things are generated from their opposites, then the dead come from the living, and the living come from the dead. Now let's think about that. Let's say something like Jim is dead, or Joe is dead, or Jane is dead, whoever. Jim is dead. That seems to logically imply that Jim was once alive. That is, if Jim is dead, then it would seem that it's logically necessary to say then that Jim was once alive. And I think we have no problem with that. That is, saying that someone is dead logically implies that they were once alive, because people can't die unless they're alive. So that notion of the dead coming from the living, although speaking of the dead is problematic, as Van Evera's article showed us, that notion of the dead coming from the living is really not all that controversial, is it? That is, that if we consider life and death opposites, and we also say that you can't die unless you've been alive, then clearly death comes from its opposite, life. That seems to be logically implied, but I don't think it really gets us. I mean, if the dead come from the living, I think that suitably sort of changed and conceptualized to make it fit, but I think it's perfectly harmonious with the Epicurean view of death. But of course, the bigger claim here is that not only do the dead come from the living, but the living come from the dead. And that's what Sebes, Socrates' friend, is hesitant to concede. Clearly, I think that, if we're thinking in terms of opposites, death and life are opposites, and if we concede that all things do come from their opposites, then it would seem that it would go both ways. Not only do the dead come from the living, but also that the living come from the dead. I think it's it's definitely an interesting idea that everything which is generated, everything that comes to be from its opposites. Whether it's true or not, I think you'd have to think about for a long time and try to apply it widely. It does, in certain cases, seem to be absolutely true. That is, that the larger does come from the smaller, the lighter does come from the darker, and things like that. Now, whether we can apply that to death is the big question. Certainly, the dead, if they have some existence in some form, come from the living. Whether the living come from the dead, I don't know. I mean, certainly biologically speaking, modern biology, we would say that the living person, the living being of any kind of animal or plant, certainly does come from the non-living. I mean, that is, so we think about what we're made of and what is, what the human or any organism is assembled from. It's assembled from just matter, and through certain processes operates as living organisms. So we could say that the living being comes from dead matter, but whether we would want to go as far as Socrates and say that the living souls come from dead souls and that sort of thing. I'm not sure that he has established that, but it certainly is an interesting way to start.